So in my last video, I talked about putting together a SRAM AXS 2x12 wireless electronic group set, especially tailored to the type of riding that I like to do, which is kind of an all-around, some gravel, some road, a decent amount of steep stuff. So it needed a lot of range, and it also needed, hopefully not huge gaps between the gears. So spoiler alert, I actually ended up getting rid of that group set and going to a Shimano 11-speed double front chainring GRX setup. And so far, I've actually been really happy with that. And why did I do that? Well, I'm going to explain that in this video, obviously. So I basically broke this down to being 5 E's. The 5 E's, why I think the Shimano mechanical GRX setup is better than the SRAM AXS. Firstly, ergonomics. This is subjective, of course, but I think the Shimano controls just feel better. I think the shifting feels better. I prefer the Shimano system of control, wherein different motions produce different effects. So you push the lever one way and, the chain moves one way. You push the lever a different way, the chain moves a different way. With the SRAM system, the electronic group set is actually a little bit different than the mechanical in that you push one lever to go up the gears and one lever to go down the gears, and then you push the two levers at the same time to shift the front chain rings. Now, I think that's a little goofy, and I caught myself trying to shift chain rings when I wanted to shift down, but I was already in the small chain ring. In contrast with the Shimano setup, if you're already in the big ring or in the small ring and you try to do it again, nothing happens. Whereas with the SRAM setup, I would accidentally push both of the buttons on the two levers, and then I got a chain ring shift that I didn't really want. Another small detail with the ergonomics is the way that the levers interact with the bars. For example, when your brake pads start to wear and they get kind of close to the bars when you're riding on the hoods, a lot of times the SRAM shifter buttons kind of get in the way of your hands, so you can't really squeeze the brakes all the way. And I found that a little bit annoying, actually. Didn't like it. All right, number 2, effectiveness. With the SRAM setup, I would get a lot of drop chains, and I'll explain why in a little bit. But with the Shimano setup, I've dropped the chain just a couple times to the inside, whereas with SRAM, I was getting the chain dropped to the outside sometimes, to the inside sometimes. So the front derailleur was really sensitive to its yaw angle. It really needed to be set up perfectly to not drop the chain. And since there's a lot of force involved with these electronic gears moving side to side, if it takes a lot of force to move the chain, then you could actually pull the derailleur out of alignment and drop a chain. Another point on the effectiveness front is the front shifting is actually kind of slow with the electronic setup. I expected it to be a bit better and more crisp, but really the Shimano mechanical is like instantaneous. Something to keep in mind here is that I actually kept the SRAM AXS front chain rings. So I'm running these SRAM 12-speed chain rings with a 3346 chain set using a Shimano Dura-Ace front derailleur. So technically not supposed to work together, I guess. But the Shimano front derailleur shifted the SRAM chain rings a lot better than the SRAM front derailleur did. Thirdly, engineering. I mentioned before how the front derailleur is really sensitive to setup. And, that's just a principle of engineering that you want to follow, is that you want to make the things you design, the assemblies you design, hard to put together incorrectly. And if you look on the Facebook group for SRAM AXS, you'll see that lots of people have the same problems, lots of drop chains, and everyone's telling each other, oh, you didn't get it aligned properly, this and that, take it to a mechanic. And then someone will say, yeah, I took it to a mechanic and I'm still dropping chains. So SRAM actually came out with this front derailleur installation tool, which I guess helps in this respect, but the Shimano front derailleur, in contrast, you set it up by putting the outer plate parallel to the chain rings, and you don't do that with the SRAM setup. The SRAM setup, they put 2 marks basically on the inside of the derailleur cage. So you'd need to look from above directly, which is really hard to do when there's a bike in the way, and try to align the center of the chain with the center of these marks. And, you know, your perspective can change a little bit depending on what angle you're looking at it, and it's pretty hard to get right. So it's just a dumb design to design something that way that takes kind of a subjective measurement to set up. Not good. Second engineering flaw that I saw was that the micro adjust was this one global offset throughout the entire cassette. Now, I thought that with this fancy electronic gearing setup, I was going to be able to fine tune the offset throughout the entire cassette and get every single shift perfect. But it was still a compromise, much like having a mechanical setup. The SRAM would still kind of be a little raspy or clicking on a couple of the cogs, and you know, you could micro adjust it a little bit one direction or the other, but you're compromising the shifting on the other cogs. And even the Shimano mechanical setup was just as good, if not better. I'm not a big fan of the SRAM brake advancing of the pads. I found that it's tough to get a good lever feel all the time, and it kind of degrades, like you bleed it and then the pads will wear a little bit and then they won't stay advanced, so your lever will go all the way to the bars. Maybe it needed to be bled better. I do have to give SRAM credit. The bleeding apparatus that they have, the bleeding edge tool, made bleeding the brakes really easy. The last engineering point that I didn't like about the SRAM setup was that the software they gave you was kind of goofy, and like the app was okay, but people were having problems with updating their firmware and needing to do complete resets and things like that. And that really is kind of worrying when you have something like that where, say, if it bricked itself or something like that, there's really nothing you can do. It's really kind of a closed ecosystem. They don't give you any way of plugging a computer in and maybe, if you wanted to, fixing your own firmware. It kind of seems like when you buy a piece of hardware, you should have the ability to maintain the software inside of it, just like you can maintain any of the parts within a mechanical device. But for some reason, companies act like software gives you some sort of competitive advantage when really you buy the hardware and then they just have to maintain the software for life and not get any more money out of you. So they really don't have much incentive to keep fixing bugs in it other than getting more sales, which is kind of like a infinite growth paradox. Yeah, I know we tolerate closed software on a lot of our devices, iPhones, for example. The fourth E, energy. Ultimately, I decided that in principle, a bike should not take any external energy to operate. You could use, external energy and batteries for sensors and things like that. But for operation, shifting, braking, all that stuff, the normal operation, the energy should come from the human. And having electronic shifting and dealing with batteries and having the potential of those going flat on you, especially if you're doing like a really long trip, it was just very unappealing. Probably wouldn't be an issue, just carry an extra battery or two and plug it in and charge it when you can. But ultimately, philosophically, it just seemed in conflict with what a bicycle is. And then lastly, the fifth E, economy. This is really the bottom line. I decided there's no way it's worth an extra on the order of $1,000 more for the setup for something that's a little bit more complicated, didn't work as well, and had the downside of needing an external energy source to work. The cost of maintenance and spare parts is also a lot higher. Like a battery's $50. The cassette itself is like $350 versus the cassette I use with my Shimano setup. I actually got an 1136 SRAM cassette, which is $90. If I wanted to go to like a 1x wide range rear cassette, the GRX rear derailleur is like on the order of $100, whereas the SRAM Eagle is on the order of $700. So you're talking some serious savings here, and I rode a bike with an Eagle mullet setup, and it shifted pretty well. Actually, it probably shifted a little bit better than the the red Axis rear derailleur that I had. And of course, you don't have a front derailleur in that setup, so you don't have to worry about the chains dropping and all of that. Ultimately, I've been really happy with the GRX 2x11 mechanical setup so far. Let's take a look at the gearing. So with the current setup, the GRX 1136 cassette with the 3346 front chain rings. Lowest gear ratio is 1.09 and the highest is 0.24. So the other setup that I had going was I had a Rotor 1136 12-speed cassette. So basically the same, well, identically the same range, but ultimately I didn't really notice the gaps changing all that much going from 12-speed to 11-speed. So that's another point that wasn't really worth it to me. That's that. That's my setup for now. I like it. It's good. It served me well. I rode the SRAM stuff for about a couple hundred miles, and I've put about a couple thousand on this GRX now, and it's just been great. Yeah, that's that. See ya.